A week ago, we listened with considerable attentiveness to Christian Heide, and I was impressed immensely by the candor of her presentation and how her life story revealed so much of what she was. With the reading from Thoreau here, I was reminded of, I believe, his comment. It might have been Ralph Waldo Emerson. I get the two confused sometimes, who said, "What you are cries out so loudly, I can't hear what you're saying." My own personal background is as a historian of philosophy. I realized my calling in life when I was in the 11th grade in high school. My brother took me to one of his philosophy classes, and I kind of knew at that time that that was what I wanted to do with my life. So I've had the good fortune to be an historian of philosophy in one way or another for, I'd say, pretty close to 60 years. There's a benefit to looking at philosophy's history because it's a give and take. It's a play back and forth. And what has devolved in modern philosophy is an awareness of the importance of perspective, of seeing things from different points of view. And I think some of our huge political struggles, as well as our economic struggles, relate to people not being able to see somebody else's point of view. I have a quotation from Friedrich Schiller with which I'd like to open. Schiller was one of the great 19th century philosophers, in the German tradition. "If God held eternal truth in his right hand and the quest for truth in his left hand, I would choose the left hand and know that I had made the right choice." There is something about the quest for truth, and there's something about the vitality that we generate for ourselves, knowing that it's a pursuit. It's not something that's packaged, neatly put away in a drawer, and that we can pull out whenever we need to refer back to it. We want to know the truth. We don't want to be deceived, and we certainly don't want to be wrong or be in error. Think of the biblical comment, "You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Our search for truth, however, begins at the most basic level, at the sense of touch. It's the most basic of the senses. It doesn't just convey hardness or softness or warmth or cold. As any baby knows, the sense of touch conveys affection, love, and involvement. In this, the most basic of the senses, knowledge and love work together most of the time in perfect harmony. Think of our most common phrases like "be sensible" or "come back to your senses." Our bodies are our most basic instruments of learning. They literally put us in touch with the world. Our bodies are constantly monitoring our place in the world. It tells us if we are warm or cold, if we are well balanced or about to fall over. And our senses relate to us our connection to the people and things around us. And when we say goodbye to people, we often say, "keep in touch." Obviously, there's a puzzlement there because they are at a distance, so how do they keep in touch? Physiologists tell us that when we embrace someone, hormonal changes go on in our bodies. Our bodies know that we need to touch and be touched, and that we need that fundamental contact that says we are connected, that we are somehow anchored in reality, and that we hope we have come back to our senses. I'm sure you've all had this experience, those of you who are parents or grandparents. All children go through a why stage. They want to know why things happen the way they do, why things work the way they do, why people do some of the strange things they do. For parents, this can be an exasperating time, but it shows the intensity of the intellectual curiosity at a time when the world is as wide open as it will ever be. We are told again by the experts that the most important learning of all goes on in the first 6 years of life. As parents and as adults, there is certainly much we can do to foster the learning of the little children. But once again, the experts tell us love and affection are the best nutrients to spur natural curiosity. We bring children to school at what seems like progressively earlier stages. And as a little side note here, the word school comes from a Greek word skole, which in Greek means leisure. So the presumption is if you have enough time that you can go to school, you must be at leisure. You have the opportunity to do some really valuable learning. While considerable effort and speculation has gone into ways of making the formal educational experience more successful, we're constantly made aware that we've not yet stumbled upon the best arrangements for successful learning experiences, and we're still puzzled about the best learning environments for our children. If you've been reading the newspapers lately, you know the Ames testing has both advocates and critics. The controversies surrounding school superintendents, as well as the hiring and firing of teachers, is a kind of index of how seriously we take grade school and high school education. Both high school and college educational programs are currently experimenting with what are called online courses. They're called MOOCs, M-O-O-C-S, massive open online courses. And while these make great teachers and great courses widely available over the internet, the evidence is that real education somehow involves a give and take, a kind of personal exchange between teachers and students, and that discussion and feedback and reflection are integral parts of the learning experience. A friend of mine who runs outdoor education programs said, "The best education is a student sitting on one end of a log and a great teacher sitting on the other end." So there is something intimately personal about a good learning experience. Whenever I visit local grade schools or high schools, I'm reminded of a remark of George Bernard Shaw: "The only time my learning was seriously interrupted was when I went to school." Learning is something we're doing all the time. The big question is, how do we get better at it? How do we learn to process the abundant sources of information that come our way? How can we make the most of the learning opportunities that are everywhere out there? Several controversies rage over college and university education. This morning's headlines in the paper are about a problem the University of Arizona has, along with many other institutions of higher education, that professors are reluctant to retire. Now, I know something about that from my own experience. You get better at what you do when you're an educator, and there does come a time when it's time to say, okay, I've done this enough, and it's time to turn it over to somebody younger. But as in my case and in the case of my wife, we retired and found out we needed to keep on doing the kinds of things that we were doing. So again, as John pointed out, when we arrived in Sun City, Oro Valley, we looked around a little bit, got involved with some programs at the university, and decided that we could create an Institute of Learning in Retirement in Sun City. We thought the first year that we might have 100 members and that we might have 2 classrooms available, and Leah and I would teach a course, and maybe we could talk somebody else into teaching a course or 2. Well, 10 years later, we have a little over 700 members, and we offer 15 courses each semester. So it's been a remarkable success and a remarkable testimony to the fact that just because you're 55 or 65 or 85 or 91, learning doesn't stop, and the need for learning doesn't stop. Behind all of this, these contentions that go on is this kind of basic question with respect to the money that we spend for college education. Is college education career preparation, or is it simply preparation for life? Well, obviously it has to be some admixture of both. If you and I are taxed to provide public education, and if we pay large amounts of money to send our own kids or grandkids to college, we expect some significant return on our money. We not only expect students to become productive members of society, we hope that they will become better human beings in the process. We expect that high schools and colleges should produce people capable of being members of the workforce, people who will engineer our bridges, figure out how to build and heat and cool our homes, provide us with good health care, and have some knowledge of how the economy works and how they can make the economy work for us. Behind all education, however, is the hope that education will make us better as human beings and somehow make society work for the benefit of all. I am made constantly aware of the primacy of what my master in learning, Aristotle, called the most important of all the sciences. Now, again, I confessed publicly that I am a historian of philosophy by long training, and the philosopher with whom I spend the most time and from whom I've learned the most is Aristotle. He was called by Dante the master of those who know, and certainly modern science has eliminated a number of the scientific convictions that Aristotle had. But the wisdom that Aristotle had about how to live human life is not excelled by any of modern day philosophers. So here is Aristotle founding the disciplines of physics and biology and astronomy, and he says, you know, at the end of all this, the most important science of all is political science. How people could get along, how society could be organized for the benefit of all its members. Well, the upheavals in Egypt and Iraq and Syria and throughout the Middle East are testimony to the fact that the right kind of learning about political science has not occurred. These civilizations are thousands of years old, but they still haven't learned how to govern themselves. Talk about a colossal failure of learning. Before we can point our fingers at anyone else, however, we clearly need to learn how to set our own political houses in order. As Theodore Roosevelt said, this will not be a good country for any of us until it is a good country for all of us. In the process of both formal and informal education, one would hope that every educated person would know how to reflect on the big questions of life. For life, as the song goes, has a way of bemusing and confusing us. Maturity means you've spent at least a little time thinking about what might be called the great questions of philosophy. What does it all mean? What do I owe to others? What are my moral obligations? What is the nature of the universe? With respect to questions like these, I have often invoked the distinction between a problem and a mystery. A problem is what you have. A mystery is what has you, because it just doesn't admit of any easy solutions. Problems like mathematical problems admit of solutions. They may not be easy, but they are available. You solve an equation and you pass on to the next problem. Mysteries admit of no easy solutions. The real mysteries puzzle us throughout our lives. This is why we have churches and synagogues and temples and mosques and meditation centers. This is where the learning that is characteristic of religion comes into play. Religion proposes answers for the questions that are too big for us to get a handle on. Religion offers aphorisms that may stop us in our tracks, give us something to think about. The great religious figures of the past and present provide us with food for thought. And again, I dig deep into my Greek philosophical heritage, and I quote from one of my favorite Stoic philosophers, Lucretius, "All things delight, but none ever satisfies." Haven't you had the experience of doing something you've looked forward to for a long time and say, it wasn't as great as I hoped it would be? All things delight, but none ever satisfies. The Bhagavad Gita, there never was a time when you and I did not exist, nor will there be any future when we truly cease to be. Or from the book of Jeremiah, I have loved thee with an everlasting love. Therefore have I drawn thee towards me, taking pity on thee. Or from the New Testament, this is eternal life, that they may know thee, the one true God. Knowing and loving are the quintessential human characteristics. In one of the greatest theological books of the Middle Ages, the Summa of St. Thomas Aquinas, this great thinker wrote, "What we can say about the mystery of the Trinity is this: in an eternal act of knowledge, the Father brings forth the Son, and the love between them is the eternal Holy Spirit." In Christianity, as in so many other religions, God is the infinite knower. Could it be that in the act of knowing, we become more like God? What's the message, or what's the takeaway from this little theological excursion? Well, in knowing, we assume certain godlike dimensions. In learning, somehow we become more like God. But learning is only the beginning. Learning is not an end in itself, but must be completed by action. Be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only. For those of us who have been knowledge workers all our lives, especially if we are teachers, it's perfectly clear that knowledge is never an end in itself, but must be completed by action. This is why one of the great Spanish mystics of the 16th century, Juan de la Cruz, wrote, "In the evening of life, you will be judged on love alone." Learning is the fire that should kindle love. The love of learning helps us find out who we really are and helps us find our own specific place in the universe. But our place in the world and our value to the world is very much determined by the depth and breadth of our capacity to love. One of the great learners of the 20th century, Albert Einstein, said science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind. We might modify this to have a takeaway message from Albert Einstein today of this: knowledge without love is lame. Love without knowledge is blind. Learning is the avenue that opens our hearts and minds.